Hi, my name is Ben Zwibelson, and I'm here to talk with you today about military design fundamentals. I work for the Joint Special Operations University, or JSOU, and JSOU is a Special Operations Forces, or SOF, focused university, and we are part of the U.S. Special Operations Command, or SOCOM. And what JSOU provides for the SOCOM enterprise, as well as the Department of Defense, federal agencies that work with SOCOM, and international military partners, as well as international military special operations forces, is SOF-specific education, outreach, research, and assistance to enable the SOF enterprise to better itself, develop, and transform over time. And in my specific area, what my team and I provide is military design, education, and outreach. So this video is really all about the fundamentals, and we use this type of a lecture, this type of a presentation for executive sessions with senior leaders, as well as outreach to organizations, and essentially a bit of a crash course, if you will, on what military design is and why when you take design concepts, which are very well known throughout the world in all types of commercial settings, from industrial design to architectural design, city planning, human-centered design, software design, and so on and so forth. But when we apply this within a security setting where it's dealing with defense, with warfare, with security and safety of populations, as well as continuing foreign policy, this is where design has to take on a different form as well as a different function. And why this matters to militaries is part of what we provide in this educational format. So with that, this whole lesson is going to be available, and there is some pre-readings, some pre-homework that we ask people to do before they go through this lesson. And we'll touch on that in a few moments. But first, why would we even need design? Why does a military organization want to be innovative or creative? How important is innovation versus something such as efficiency or reliability, uniformity, prediction, precision, and control? So these are competing things that military and security organizations, as well as law enforcement, fire departments, ambulance organizations, everyone's trying to do this within public safety as well as security. But how do we figure out what we're good at and what we need help with? And when we really look at our organizations, which ones does our organization prefer, even at the expense of the others? In this image, you'll see a whole bunch of different terms. I want you to take a few moments and select the first two that you think most strongly associate with your organization, assuming that you work in one of these security domains. And then I want you to also take two words on this slide that are the opposite of what your organization does, or perhaps the furthest thing from what your organization really is interested in. Just take a few minutes and think about both of those two extremes. And we'll return to this in a bit. Okay. So, when I mentioned that there was some homework, if you're watching this video and you're trying to get the full maximum design exposure out of this, please read these two articles and return back to this video and don't go any further. Now, these articles should be available in PDF and they're open source. The first one is by Hadlow, and the second one is by Vertesi, and we'll show them below. So the Hadlow article should be here, and the Vertesi article should be available here as well. Now, both of these authors are looking at the London Underground map, and it was created by a man named Henry Beck, or Harry to his friends. And what Henry Beck did in the 1930s was something pretty amazing, and it's a great example of commercial design. So at first you might say, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a military design presentation. Why are they drawing from a civilian example? Well, here's one of the tricks on the facilitation. Oftentimes with military organizations, but this is also for any organization, the things that they do best, the things that they hold closest to them, are the hardest things for them to really critically examine and reflect upon. And what we find is that if we give a military-themed example up front, our military professional they tend to not be able to get the depth of the meaning out of it because sometimes they kick into those institutional defenses. Just as if you were to show a software company an example that had to do with software design, it's much easier to take an organization and give them something completely different. And so in this case, the London Underground is a great thing that has nothing to do with the military whatsoever. So our military organizations have no problem looking at this. So in the first article by Hadlow, he outlines the history of how Beck had the challenge, did his research, thought about it, went underground and experienced the subways, and then developed his groundbreaking map that was unlike any other map that had been made. And the reason for this is that the technology and the development at the time was moving cities to tunnel underground and have the machinery so that they could ferry people very rapidly in these subways. However, at that point, everyone was still using the logic of making above-ground maps, which means that everything would be geospatially centered on the actual geographic locations and landmarks. And so the above-ground maps were expected to be identical to the below-ground maps. At the same time, Beck had the challenge of multiple companies that were not cooperating or sharing their subway lines with one another and competing with them in an open market. And so what this created was different maps that were incomplete and only available if you traveled with that one line. The London Transit Authority was struggling with this because the competing companies, the complexity of the underground mapping, and the problems with creating a map that was small enough for a subway user to use, but also referential to the above-ground maps that people expected, it was creating these maps that could not be used. They were just completely useless. And so Beck went underground and decided he would make a completely different map. So in your readings that you have hopefully completed, you'll know that Beck created this map that was different. It was different from any other map that had been made because it was dealing with time and space and movement underground where geography was irrelevant. All that mattered was where you were in relation to stops, time to the next stop, and mapping those stops out in a grid that made sense to those people that were underground versus above ground. In the second article, Vertesi interviews people that have lived in London their whole lives. And what's fascinating here is that in this examination, they ask them to draw how London works. And the way they frame that question is they don't differentiate between the above and below ground. And for people who have lived in London their entire lives and know Beck's map inside and out, they have a very hard time actually mapping London because one map, the below ground map, doesn't correspond with the geography that these people know and live with in terms of landmarks. And so this highlights what Beck's map has done in terms of the social construction of reality for Londoners as well as those who transit and use this underground map, as well as all the cities around the world that have adapted Beck's technique of changing how the map works at a logical level and an organizational level below ground. And so some of the impacts of this are fascinating. Beck's map has influenced property value above ground, irrelevant to what's actually in the geography, but entirely fixated on whether or not you are close to one of Beck's map points that are considered valuable. And so these types of things are fascinating in that Beck was able to transform how Londoners thought, as well as how they made sense of traveling underground versus above ground. And lastly, in terms of design resistance, and this goes into many of our leaders' questions that say, well, why is military design so hard to implement? Why is innovation and creativity and transformation so difficult? When we look back at almost every act of innovation, not just the Beck map, but any act of innovation, there's an enormous amount of institutional resistance, a rejection of things changing so much so that this innovation is going to transform these things in such a significant way. And in this case, the London Underground map was rejected by the Transit Authority, and Beck was handing out free copies of his experimental map, and only after the population demanded it did the Transit Authority begrudgingly approve this map, despite the entire time kicking and screaming. And if you think about other examples of innovation, whether you're thinking about the Post-it note, the rise of Netflix and its relationship with Blockbuster Video, or going into the military side, Billy Mitchell and his visionary understanding of aerial bombardment, or aerial bombing, as well as aircraft carriers, and for those of you that are really strong Billy Mitchell fans, his innovation on military paratroop operations that he envisioned in 1918, which was World War I, way before it first emerged in World War II as a working prototype. And so in all these examples, the institution really kicks back hard. And so this is just the last part to consider as we look into why military design matters, how it works, and why it's valuable to organizations today. So this first exercise is one that we do when we present this lecture to groups. And what we'd ask you to do, if you're watching this individually, I want you to pause the video and go and find at least one or two other people that you can do this exercise with, just so that you can get that full design experience. If it doesn't matter, you can press on through. Now this is what we call the coffee cup challenge, or the amazing, impossible, never before seen coffee cup challenge. So you'll have 3 minutes, and what we want you to do is get a piece of paper and a pen, and we want you to draw out your idea of a coffee cup that does not yet exist, a coffee cup that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So you have 3 minutes to create this, and then also invite your other participants to do this. We normally do this with an entire group, 30, 40, even 100 people. And then what we do is we have people, if you're seated in an auditorium, on your left and your right, you have to exchange your ideas. Now here's the catch. If one of the people that you're exchanging your ideas with on the coffee cup, if they came up with something similar enough that you both know it's kind of the same thing, such as we've seen quite often a coffee cup that has a Wi-Fi, or a coffee cup that has a drone delivery refill system. So hopefully you didn't already think of those. If you come up with something that someone else has, it doesn't count. And what we're trying to do there is see how many people within a large group, or even a small group, can come up with truly innovative, unique ideas that no one else has thought of very quickly. So let's begin the exercise now. Great, so 3 minutes is up. And so what we'd like you to do now is spend a couple of minutes sharing with the other people that you're doing this exercise with. Now, if you're facilitating this, what you can do is you want to see how many of the coffee cup ideas were eliminated as the groups are discussing. And what you'll hear is you'll hear the murmur, 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 then a lot of laughter, maybe some heated exchanges back and forth, and then people kind of saying, oh, okay, I guess you did come up with my idea. Or you'll see some smiling, beaming faces out in the audience triumph that they have come up with something that no one else in their row or their area has come up with. And if you have the time, if you're doing this live, call on those people and try to talk with them. Sometimes you'll have an audience that's filled with lots of different ideas, but as you start making them all interact with each other, you'll suddenly see a lot of these ideas that they thought were creative and unique and original. Oh no, that person over there came up with a very similar idea. How'd that happen? And in a larger group, say 30 to 90 people, you'll see that 50 to 75% of the ideas immediately wash away when this happens. And so this coffee cup challenge is really about, why do organizations struggle with innovation? And this is really why military design is very useful for security organizations. We have us think about why this is hard. We show the students and have them experience this in real time with these types of exercises. And then we say, okay, if this isn't working for us, then what are some of the tools, techniques, methods, and language, as well as underlying theory, can we put into your organization through education that can provide the entire audience with the tools and the potential to have them all come up with radically different, diverse ideas, not on a coffee cup, but on a real security challenge, something with great complexity and uncertainty. So going from that coffee cup to something really difficult is a more advanced step. Right now, we just want to look at, well, why can't we even come up with a new coffee cup idea? And that's part of the experience. So this first exercise was just a quick example of how we do this at JSOU. And if this was a good experience for you, we'll have a couple more exercises throughout this presentation that we normally showcase in these design fundamental type engagements. So most of our security organizations are very familiar with a certain type of way of making sense of reality, of looking at how they organize, how they act, how they decide and make sense of reality, whether it's warfare or whether it's a security or a federal agency that's doing some type of difficult, challenging governmental requirement. And so most of our organizations tend to do this type of thinking. And for our military audience, they'll be very used to this type of planning, this type of organizational structure. It's linear, it's mechanistic, it deals with a lot of Newtonian physics metaphors. And we like to reverse engineer the structures and then provide this in our military doctrine as well as our professional military education through our exercises, our war games, our simulations, and then all the way out into military activities where we have very deliberate and very analytic-oriented processes that result in operations orders and fragmentary orders, as well as deliberate planning, policy even, and these types of processes, they work in certain contexts, but they really don't work in others. And sometimes our military organizations really struggle with not only distinguishing between where these work well and where they don't work well, but what to do when we're in a context where it's not working well and it won't. And so this becomes the challenge. Now, we're going to get into what military design does and why it's different. And this is ultimately a philosophical question. Now, in order to go into philosophy, we're going to have to use some philosophical terms. And sometimes this is what becomes challenging for a military organization that really wants things in very, very simple, concise language. And this does become a challenge of terminology. However, I like to open with my audience with an example using sports. Once again, we move out of the military and go into something completely different. And then as a facilitator, it becomes much more convenient to get those students to think about these things, particularly if it's a very disruptive or challenging question about deeply held tenets, rituals, beliefs, and values. So if we look at sports and we said, okay, we have baseball and we have boxing, two very different sports. Now, what if you met somebody who had never seen either of the sports, never seen boxing, never been exposed to baseball, and they asked you, well, can you explain to me what they both mean and what the difference is between them? Now, immediately, if you were to answer this person's question and explain to them how boxing as a sport works and how baseball as a sport works, if you were to do them separately, you could easily go into the details. Well, these are the rules of baseball, and this is how baseball works. And these are the rules of boxing, and this is how boxing works. But suppose the person said, well, I want to understand sporting in general. Like how does boxing and baseball relate to each other? And this is where we go philosophical, in this case on the sports side, because when we start asking questions about, in this case in the military sphere, well, we know how to do planning, and we know how to do strategy in this certain modern way. This design thing's different. Why do we need design? How does design relate to planning and strategy? How are they different? So we immediately are at this philosophical level in a military concern. So going back to the sporting example, you cannot explain the sport of boxing using only baseball explanations. It doesn't work that way. And so sometimes the insistence of, well, explain to me military design, but only use doctrinal terms that we already have in our military planning lexicon. It's really not going to work, because you have to go to that philosophical level beyond where we have the sports themselves. We have to talk about the philosophy of sporting, of competition, of human competitiveness, and why we see this as entertainment and inspirational and challenging, and each year we'll root for the same teams, whether it's baseball, soccer, boxing, or hockey, or what have you. So this deals with some interesting philosophical concepts. The first one that we're going to introduce is called ontology. We're going to first use this word ontology and frame why it's important, and why, even though most people aren't familiar with this term normally, and it's not used in our military doctrine, it's not used in policy that much, this is really your gateway tool into cracking open why your organization thinks the way it does, and how it's also not thinking about things within complex security challenges. So what we have here first is the Colosseum of Rome on the left, and then on the right-hand side, the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And even if you haven't been to either of these, people know a lot about them. They can recognize them instantly. For those of you that have been there, you can actually touch them. You can confirm that they're there. If you're not thinking about either of these things, they're still there. So this is what ontology is. It's about how we understand what is and is not real within the world, within reality. And these things are how we can interact with reality in a tangible way, where we can touch and measure and do analysis. Now, there's a second element to ontology that's very important, and this is objectivity and subjectivity. So if I were to tell you that the Colosseum is in Rome, but the Eiffel Tower is actually also in Rome as well, you'd be able to render one of those statements ontologically, objectively false. Now, if I was to tell you that if you had only one plane ticket, you need to go to the Colosseum in Rome because it's a much better place to visit. Now that is a true statement per se, but it's very subjective. So it's a ontologically subjective statement. And this distinction is important for us as we frame out how ontology works in design thinking. Ontology then becomes the first major ingredient to constructing paradigms. And paradigms are a very important element of military design. It's for how groups and organizations and militaries and even entire societies frame reality, which is a combination of those actual physical things of which ontology helps us cognate, but also the subjective, the irrational, the socially constructed things. And this is what we're going to get into shortly. But a paradigm is how we as human beings tend to rationalize things so that we can use a logic, so that we can use a subsequent methodology. This is what underpins joint planning processes, military decision-making methodologies, and so forth. And this becomes an increasingly important aspect of how we understand ourselves, as well as how we understand how we interact with war and warfare. So ontology, which we just introduced, is an important building block for understanding what a paradigm is and why it's important on how it helps organizations and groups of individuals, as well as individuals themselves, make sense and rationalize how the world ought to be. So ontology, as Martin states, helps us order, codify, frame, and classify our perceptions, our data, and our theoretical abstractions. This is really important for understanding how design operates, as well as how design differs from planning. Now, there's a second element that ties into ontology, and it's another philosophical term that we're going to introduce next. If ontology is the philosophical construction of what things are in reality, all things, the things that we can encompass on what is real and what is not real, the things that we can actually touch and measure, then epistemology is the construction of how we know what we know about these ontological things. Thus, ontology in the end deals with actual things in reality, whether it's a French or an Italian famous monument, while epistemology deals with the socially constructed reality upon this physical reality that humans apply to know how the world ought to work from within their frame or their paradigm. To put this another way, the graphic that you see here presents all of the major military services derived military decision-making methods, although a few of these are a little bit out of date. Nonetheless, this graphic helps to show the concepts here used, such as levels of war, elements of operational art, processes to identify what a military problem is, how to determine a desired end state, to establish a mission statement or create courses of action, and so on and so forth. The very language that we use, and the metaphors even behind these terms, the doctrine that we construct to inform and train our forces so that the same military activities are reliably uniform and predictable over and over consistently. This is what our military epistemology helps generate. Let's try to show this one additional way. So the little girl here in the hot tub, she's experiencing pain. And so epistemologically, pain is something that human beings recognize as an experience that all living creatures feel in some sort of way. So there's epistemological objectivity in that we know pain exists, but you can't put it in a jar or a bottle. You can't precisely capture it the way you can with something that's physical or real. So it's something that's conceptually understood and maintained in our individual and social consciousness. But the subjective quality of pain is that everyone experiences it differently, whether it's addressing childbirth or spicy hot wings. Every human being experiences pain in vastly different ways, requiring us to look at it from an epistemological stance, both objectively and subjectively. This is one way that military design is going to differentiate between shared beliefs about warfare, or how an organization looks and thinks about war, and whether there are other ways, subjective ways or objective ways, to interpret these same shared or individual socially constructed ideas. So this second exercise that we're going to have you do, we need you to grab a pen and paper and get ready. So this image here has been used in brain research, different scientific studies, and it's also been featured on really fun television shows like Brain Games. So when we look at this image, we want you to ignore the background, the blue sky and the strange kind of brownish ground, and just focus on the clamshell. So on this clamshell, we want you to take a moment and study it and tell us how many colors you see on the clamshell. Now, for argument's sake, white and black will be considered colors here, just for this exercise. Now, write down the number of colors that you feel that you see here. It might be 2 or 17 or 5 or 3 or 100. Just put your number down. And then once you're done, we're going to go to the next part of the exercise. You could even pause this here for a moment and write down the numbers. Okay, so everyone pencils down and you've got your number. Now here's the trick. What's happening here is that at an individual level, and in terms of brain and human physiology and biology, we are actually distorting reality of what our eyes are actually seeing. If we were to cover up the shaded area here, just like this, there's only one color on the clamshell. So what's really happening is that our brains are taking the accurate information from our eyes and we are changing it, distorting it, creating false reality because it's supposed to make more sense to our internal logic. And this is happening at an individual level. So let's go ahead and remove those black barriers and show you the clamshell again. And notice our eyes automatically are still presenting the same information, but our brains right now are still providing that false information. And for most people, you still see it the wrong way. You have to hold your fingers up to the screen. You can do that now, and then suddenly it flips back. So why is this? This is just a quick example. And once again, we're doing design immersion here. You have to experience it. But this is what demonstrates why ontology and epistemology are so important in understanding how military design works and why it's a benefit for complex security challenges. It's because if individuals are distorting reality just inside our own brains, then what happens when organizations confronting extraordinarily difficult, complex military challenges, what happens when those organizations may be distorting these things as well with our own faulty logic? Let's move on to one more exercise to demonstrate how at an individual level, once again, our own brains will distort and deceive what our eyesight, in this case, are presenting as accurate information about reality. So here's one more exercise where we're actually even going to tell you what's going to happen next, and you can try to see if you can fight your brain and stop it from misinterpreting the information. You see two rectangles here, and they are exactly the same size, same color, same location. We're not going to move them. There's no trickery here. This is all going to happen inside of your own head. So we're going to position a railroad track from a nice perspective going off into the distance right on behind these. And what your brain is going to do is kick into survival mode in that when you quickly need information on perspective and scale, and if there's a limited time or light or whatever, the bottom rectangle is going to appear smaller while the top rectangle is going to appear larger and larger, no matter how much you try to fight it. So let's try it. Ready? 3, 2, 1. There. Now, unless you cheat and start squinting, which some of our students have done, and if you keep looking at both rectangles, no matter what you do, that top rectangle keeps getting bigger while the bottom rectangle keeps getting smaller. Our brains are reinterpreting the information that our eyes are giving us and distorting reality so that it makes sense according to our logic, our rules, our patterns. And so this is just one example of what happens individually with biology in this case. So what happens when a military organization running off of its own paradigm, using its own methods, its rules, its doctrine, its methodologies, its decision-making criteria, all these things, if you cannot get down into the philosophy, the social paradigm construction, if you cannot tease out what are the ontological, objective, and subjective structures going on, and what is the epistemology? Is the epistemological objectivity and subjectivity mixed? And are we distorting what reality is, acknowledging that reality is complex? And not just complex, but humans add that socially constructed additional layer of complexity on top of it. So attempting to follow simple rule sets and very clear linear logic and believe that this will help us make sense of all possible contingencies and problems in warfare, this just falls short. And this is where military design helps deconstruct and challenge some of the existing beliefs that we currently use, as well as open up new cognitive maneuver space so that we can discover, experiment, and implement new ones. We need to distinguish briefly between systematic logic and systemic logic. Both are critical for making our way through the world, particularly for security organizations dealing with complex challenges. but they're not interchangeable any more than screwdrivers and hammers are, or oil and water. In fact, the desire for everything in warfare to be uniform and interchangeable is itself an example of systematic thinking that does apply in certain contexts, in certain relationships and dynamics, but cannot apply to a fully complex, immersive, and dynamic security challenge. Systematic thinking should feel very familiar to all of you. It essentially forms the basis for all rationalized modern military thought, doctrine, methodology, military theory, and even modern military terminology. The professionalization of the modern military occurred over the last 3 centuries, where formal education, modern military doctrine, and a merit-based promotion model replaced the feudal era model of essentially a land-based economy, titled elite, localized, and often highly ritualized models for warfare. The simultaneous arrival of the Industrial Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, and the rise of new technology such as steam power, explosives, and new weapons of war demanded that artillery, fortifications, engineering, and complex mathematics for navigation, as well as logistics, would require highly educated and special skilled new military professionals. The very language of the modern military profession is entirely rested upon mathematical, engineering, and physics metaphors, drawing from natural sciences. Terms such as centers of gravity, line of effort, mass, speed, end state, stabilization, and even policy terms such as collapse state, destroy, defeat, penetrate, seize, secure, degrade, obscure. All of these things, including spectrum of war, levels of war, are all Newtonian physics or natural science metaphors. Systematic logic, and on the left-hand side of the slide here, demonstrates A plus B will equal C. And this type of logic underpins practically all systematic logic, even at an abstract level. Input will lead to output. In order to do this, we need a stable reality so that we can structure, for example, principles of war, and then articulate that regardless of the conflict, regardless of where it happens or when in history, every battle, every war will demonstrate some relationship of principles of war. This provides uniformity, reliability, repetition, and prediction. It provides the basis for analytic thought on warfare. It also provides reductionism, where we break things down, such as PMISI PT or MUSMAS or any of the other military categorical acronyms that we use. Systematic logic is what forms what the modern military does in the images that you see here. Now let's move over to systemic logic next. Compared to the last slide, this slide tends to generate a lot more discussion as well as reaction from students that see this in our courses. Now, in the last slide, you saw a traditional World War II-esque images of militaries doing the things that militaries find very familiar and essentially identical to what we're doing today, 80 years later. This image, though, is a bit disturbing for many. While there is some military drilling in the background, children mimicking executions is not really considered appropriate for play. In fact, this image makes people distract from what I'm talking about when I'm presenting the exercise. And so we go into discussing the narratives of why we need more information on this image. So when you think about systematic logic, A plus B equals C, versus here, systemic logic, the example of the king died and then the queen died is presented in the upper right in red. So just like the image that you see here that just begs for more information, the statement about the king and queen also is a narrative that requires us to inquire more. Why did the king die? When? How did he die? Did the queen die right afterwards? Were they in a car accident? Or did the king die of old age? And was the queen very young and she went on to have a very long reign and have a family? Did the queen poison the king? Was the king attacking the queen and she killed him in self-defense? Was the king assassinated? These are things that can't be answered because the statement there requires narrative. It cannot be reduced into inputs and outputs like you saw in systematic logic on the last slide. The whole is more than a sum of the parts. This involves multiple paradigms, different perspectives on interpreting reality, where going back to the exercises you just did, the clamshell can be seen in different colors, and our own minds, as well as our own organizations, will reinterpret and even distort actual reality and substitute our own. This is where emergence and nonlinearity are prominent because complex systems don't behave in a way that can be simplified. There are systems within systems. There is the element of paradox and emergence and nonlinearity, where analytic reasoning alone, which is predominant in systematic logic, it's insufficient and sometimes even counterproductive. There's an interplay between subjectivity and objectivity, which goes back into our introduction of ontology, epistemology, and how there are subjective and objective qualities between those. Systemic logic is not concerned with the inputs linked to outputs because complex dynamic systems generate multiple different competing and paradoxical worldviews that lead to different conclusions about what is actually happening within reality. Systemic logic differs from systematic logic in that there's a complex reality already existing without human beings at all, such as hurricanes or beach erosion or motions of celestial objects that are extraordinarily complex. And on top of this reality, human beings go ahead and collectively add a second order by involving human shared understandings, that epistemology that we were talking about. And humans maintain and perpetually transform this social construction of reality through which we all must try to rationalize that first world, that first order complexity, by using this second order of complexity. Systematic logic aids in the first order to conduct analysis, to seek those inputs and outputs, to try to establish some sense of uniformity, order, prediction, and control. Systemic logic aids in making sense of how messy reality ends up when humans collectively interpret that reality in so many fascinating and different ways. Within the context of warfare, this is where militaries struggle because we tend to tilt towards systematic logic and ignore or misunderstand the importance of systemic logic. And this, of course, is where military design enables deeper understanding and greater appreciation of both of these. Let's return back to both the homework readings and the very first exercise that we had you do at the beginning of this masterclass lesson. Do you remember the words that we put up? And we asked you to select the 2 words that most align with either your organization or your department or your unit that you're with. And then we asked you to circle 2 words that were the antithesis or the opposite, or the area that your organization would probably find the least important. Thinking about that and then applying all the concepts that we've already introduced thus far in the masterclass, and then thinking about what Beck was doing for the London Transit Authority, for the City of London, and ultimately for all of society on how we understand and think about maps above and below the ground. Which of these words would you say align best with systematic logic and systemic logic? So sometimes an organization may choose to focus more on systemic logic. However, in security organizations, we tend to see a majority are tilted towards systematic logic, and therefore some of the words that you may have chosen that best represent or you best align with the organization tend to be analytic, systematic type words. And there's nothing wrong with this. We do need maps just like you see on the left, traditional maps that work in those contexts. However, when a military organization or leadership or the society at large is demanding their security organization be adaptive, creative, innovative, nimble, all these concepts, they don't work exclusively with one frame, particularly a frame that endorses and espouses a systematic approach to warfare. And instead, we have to be able to oscillate between the two, provide equal understanding, attention to detail, and focus and emphasis in terms of education, professional development, and within how an organization spends its time during the day. How much are we dedicating towards one versus the other? If we're looking at different types of maps, if our organization really does need a new map that does not yet exist, something that's entirely different, how are we going to create the context, the safe area, if you will, within your organization cognitively so that your people can bring this into reality? And lastly, if we can't do this with coffee cups, just like the last challenge that you did, then how are we supposed to do this with truly dynamic, complex security challenges? This is where military design becomes an important cognitive tool within your organization so that we can be able to move from one to the other. This next portion is going to address the different types of design methodologies that are out there. If you're taking this master class as an executive leader, or if this is your first experience diving into the design world, this is going to be an important section because we're going to go over the fundamentals of primary design methodologies that you may encounter and why they differ and how they apply to different contexts. So when somebody says they do design, it's similar to our sports discussion earlier, boxing and baseball. It would be somebody saying, I do sports. So the challenge there is, well, what kind of sports do you do? And this ties into when someone says they're doing design, we have to say, well, in what context? For what outputs? For what desired goals? What are you trying to achieve? And what methodologies might be more appropriate for the context that you're designing in? And you'll see in the slide here that there's a whole range of different graphical depictions of different methodologies. Now, some of these are commercial design applications, whether industrial or human-centered or software. And in all of these different applications, design is very beneficial. But if you take one type of design and apply it to a completely different context, such as a complex security context, it may not achieve the design that you want. And this is why doing different types of design and understanding which design is best for the challenge that you have is important for all leadership to appreciate, particularly in the security applications that we will be focusing on. We're going to start first with human-centered design, and there's a fascinating history of how design development in the 20th century, both on the commercial side and on the military side, overlapped significantly, going all the way back to World War I and the development of the German Bauhaus movement that was then later shut down by the Germans just before World War II. And then later in Germany in the Ulm School, you had the first modern designers that helped really inspire this particular movement, human-centered design, such as Horst Rittel. And in the 1950s and 60s, you had this huge explosion of different types of design overlapping with psychology, sociology, complexity theory, and other constructs that brought about in the late 80s, early 90s, this hexagonal model that became very popular at Stanford as well as other universities. And this became how designers would begin to incorporate the subjective aspects of ontology and epistemology into designing for groups of human beings and individuals, particularly focusing on empathy and complexity. Nearly all human-centered design methodologies feature the following. While industrial design favored the product, human-centered design focuses significantly on the user orientation. Human-centered design is hands-on, tends to have an informal, collaborative atmosphere that also is often fun. Divergent thinking is prioritized over convergent processes, and this is done through lots of iterations of ideation sessions where anything can be done and actually encouraged. There's a rapid prototyping and an emphasis on learning from failure. Experimentation is coupled to concepts of empathy, not only of the design sponsor, but also of the shareholders and others that may be affected by the design process. Here in this slide, we've taken the methodology that we've already been looking at for human-centered design, and we've applied what we provide here at JSOU in some of our advanced design courses. This is where we deconstruct into the epistemology of why is design done in this particular way and what's really going on beneath the methodological structures and the language and the processes. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this for this executive session. However, in this example, towards the far right side, we demonstrate in the epistemological level that there's three general outputs that are occurring with any type of human-centered design application. Either there is an extension of the current system of production and profit, ideally with a slightly better or newer iPhone or technological tool or what have you. And another output is that there's a disruptive change in the market, something truly radical, such as a brand new thing that redefines the entire market. There's also the potential of a market rejection, where even if something is ahead of its time or truly amazing, it can still be rejected by the society or the targeted group, purely for a whole variety of different reasons. Again, the intent here is just to provide a quick overview so that you'll be familiar with human-centered design methodologies when you encounter them. We're going to go into the next series of slides and discuss why this type of approach in designing carries with it certain advantages as well as disadvantages if you're trying to apply this within a security context versus a purely economic one.
Germany. I would like to challenge you a little bit because your HILS program was only successful. Your HILS program was only successful because someone in your business said this provides more money at the end. If you couldn't bring up more money for IBM, or even if you would run IBM into bankruptcy by running HILS, there would be no HILS any longer. And that's our problem in the military. The defense challenge at the moment is on the political side. It's not on the military side. You cannot find Facebook with cannons and stuff like that. So the internal changes we are going through, we cannot put a money value like you did on. So, and therefore, if I take your assumption of money and put it in my world, it doesn't work. And this gets me the conclusion maybe HILS is not working in my world.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to get done. I would, and I don't know your specific situation or the complexities of the world. They're very different for sure. But you're assuming that HILS are all targeted towards some product outcome. You may very well have a project where you need to go alter your funding processes. That's a project that needs to be worked, and the stakeholders in that process are potentially the politicians. And what actions do they need to take? And what do you need to do to trigger those actions? So they can be applied to any objective that you want to pursue. The one thing I will say is that if you do run these things, the way that the HILS are validated, it's the only way I've ever seen that if you actually do the process, you will never go bankrupt. Because you never do anything that is not validated by real people in the real world that are your intended audience. I don't know if you would have more insight into the specifics of the vagaries of funding and all that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'd say one other distinction, we've talked about this in previous engagements on, how do we frame out some of the differences in a security context versus a user or product experience context or industry. And so just a couple of them that we've talked about, and I'll throw them out the audience. We already mentioned one. Phil talked about monopolies. And what we really mean by that is businesses aren't allowed to be a monopoly, and actually really great leaders, really great people can move between industry easily. You could work for Goodyear one day, and then you're working for Kraft cheese the next day. If you're good at what you do, you can't do that in the military. If you are in the Navy, except for in a joint environment, you're going to be in the Navy, and you're actually very limited on your career path. And oh, by the way, it's up or out in many organizations, where if you don't make a certain grade or follow a certain timeline, you're done. If you want to become a U.S. Army Ranger, you can't take a correspondence course or go to an alternative course. You go to the United States Army Ranger School, and you graduate, or you don't. So monopolies are slightly different in that regard for the military, and it gives a great deal of control in uniformity and repetition, but at what cost? So when you have monopolies, you actually reduce the ability to think creatively and innovatively. And there's a couple other differences, one being that militaries are not-for-profit organizations. Now, we're supposed to be great stewards of our funding. Now, that's sometimes questionable in activities. But we don't go out of business, even if we're defeated. So the Iraqi army today, there is an Iraqi army. Now, a lot of the people are different, but there's still an Iraqi army, even though they were defeated. And so security organizations have to be there. One other distinction is that there's actually a kind of a nice inverse between the two. The more that any business can do business, the more security there is. And so right now in Manchester, England, you have law enforcement, you have security, and so the cost of doing business is extraordinarily low for IBM. But what about the cost of doing business in Syria right now? Or somewhere else where it's an extremely volatile, dangerous. Now, you can do business there, but what are all those additional costs? Now, here's the inverse. How many of you in your military experience have done peacekeeping operations or know of peacekeeping operations? And how restricted were you? In probably pretty significantly, right? But those of us that have engaged in high-intensity conflict or the beginning of an invasion, a lot more free play. And so that actually, if you imagine that, it's a difference there. And so where are we? We're not ever on the opposites, but we are operating in different areas. We have business even in high-intensity conflicts. But there's so much restriction, and we in the military, we have so much freedom versus
Interesting.
When you're having incredible freedom, we are actually restricted significantly. So these aren't opposites. It's just talking about the context. When we talk about a security context and design, and we talk about a industrial or a business or academic context of design, they all are kind of blending together. But what does the user need, and what behavior are we trying to change in what context? If you're trying to change or modify behavior in a military context, there'll be different elements versus trying to change a consumer's decision or a product decision. Just a few thoughts.
Reminds me of a design workshop we did not too long ago in a military context where one of the participants came up to me at the break and was so excited. He's like, there's great diversity in the room. And I looked around and I didn't see much to the eye. And he said, there's one person from the Navy, there's one Marine, and we also have somebody from the Air Force, right? I'm like, I guess that's diversity, right? If I could dig a little bit deeper into your experience, Phil. You had that great slide that went from red to teal, our team, sort of internal IBM design folks versus client side, right? Yep. And then you talk about diversity from sort of the couple different variations of diversity, but I'd love to know, on the slide you had organized it based off subject matter expertise as being sort of the primary criterion, right? Yep. The HR person, the process analyst, et cetera. Do you look for psychometric traits or cognitive preferences at all, or how do you, when you think about who's a great person to engage from the client side to bring into the workshop environment, knowing that they represent sort of the wild card of the soup, right? And like Yep. They're not from your team, they're not formally trained in design. You've identified them for their subject matter expertise, but who makes a great design participant from the client side?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way it kind of, in the perfect world, and sometimes it's anybody who will actually spend time with us, but in the perfect world, so it starts with the research. It starts with field-based research. It starts with data, quant, whatever you can get a hold of, to actually form the hypotheses underpinning your personas. And then you go back out in the world and you test those personas. That in and of itself is an iterative process. Starts in the field, gathering all sorts of insights. In that situation, you want a very diverse set, as many people as you can identify. In a short project, it might be 20 or 30 different people that, roughly speaking, populate the users or the target stakeholders in this exercise. As you synthesize those, you narrow them down into these personas. The personas are what scales across your broader internal team. You obviously can't everybody on the internal team can't interact with every single person in the world. So you've got a dedicated research function that is interacting and bringing back the generative research that forms the personas and tests them. Once the team is aligned around the personas, the heavily informed personas, and you start working on your hills, what is the differentiation? How are we going to move these people? If they have these traits, how are we probably going to move them? Once you've established your hills, and there's 3 and only 3 hills at any given point in time for a project, then is really the people that are starting to really co-create with you. And now you go back out into the real world and you try to find the most extreme example of a person who would help you take the hill. Now the problem with finding those people in the beginning is the potential for them to take you off into a singleton space is very high. But because you've got all of this research and because you're now targeting at a hill, the fact that you have an extreme user is actually very good, because if you satisfy the extreme user, you will by definition satisfy everybody else. An example, if you were thinking about a gaming app, right? If you went to I'll use some stereotypes here, but if you went to the geekiest gamer on earth and tried to understand what they wanted or needed, you would build something crazy out here, and the bulk of the world would not want it. It'd be too advanced. So kind of what you do is you get the swath of the world, you understand the swath of the world, this is what we need to move this population, this is our hypothesis about this is what we're going to do and deliver to the world. Then you go get that gamer, and you have that person help you take the hill. It's rooted in a broader understanding. So that's kind of how it works that single person, or it doesn't take many, by the way. Once you have a well-defined hill, 1 or 2 or 3 humans are all you need. It's incredible how it scales.
I can tell you, I'd rather see those 1 or 2 or 3 people than sit in 1, 2, or 3,000 more meetings.
Yeah.
That slide.
The takeaway here is that human-centered design is one of many different types of design that can be applied. However, taking human-centered design and directly inserting it into a military decision-making methodology or within your organization may not achieve the design outputs that you're seeking. Human-centered design methodologies are extremely useful for organizational transformation, looking at new products, user experiences, or gaining a market advantage. This is about design in the monopoly of commerce versus designing in the monopoly of organized violence. When we say organized violence, what we mean there is that security forces that are doing a wide range of activities, whether it's from humanitarian aid all the way up to high-intensity, full-scale combat, security forces require human-centered design outputs. They also use industrial design, but they additionally require unique design methodologies dissimilar from the human-centered design processes that you just saw. We're going to unpackage those next. As you saw in some of the previous panel discussions as well as the content, human-centered design and application within security force context, it's going to be a little bit tricky. Security forces are not in a competitive economic context in that they don't really go out of business. The discussion of the higher the intensity of conflict, the greater resource demands for any business to do commercial design, but the inverse is that militaries in a high-intensity conflict actually have fewer restrictions and greater freedom to act versus in strict humanitarian type or low-intensity context where there's an enormous amount of policy influence over what a military can and can't do. The discussion of militaries and monopolies, the role of military doctrine, military culture, traditions, as well as the language that we use to articulate what warfare is and is not. All of these things tie into how can you assimilate design thinking into how your organization makes sense and organizes behaviors and activities within a complex security environment. Military design first emerged in the 1990s, and it started with the Israeli Defense Forces, largely led by Brigadier General retired Dr. Shimon Nave and a defense think tank known as OTRI. This was the first time that military design was established, in that it was created as a new methodology that entirely broke with existing planning traditional practices. This eclectic group of Israeli military professionals and academics began to build a multidisciplinary design methodology. This methodology did not seek to improve user experiences or products such as commercial design, nor did this methodology try to build upon the existing traditional planning logic. Instead, this was radical. This was something entirely different, and it did indeed shock the organization. The SOD methodology originally consisted of 7 iterative stages. Designers would conduct systems framing, and then frame a system of opposition. They would then follow a familiar design epistemological process of prototyping and experimentation. Nave termed this as reframing operational heuristics and learning meta-theory, reframing initial system frame, and problematization. Some of these terms are cumbersome. They are explored and defined within SOD design, as well as other design educational platforms such as at JSOU. Designers would then reframe their strategy for transformation within SOD and then conduct an operational framing as their last stage. SOD's objective is to deconstruct all assumptions and to design the problem metaphorically and literally through mapping the system of the rival. When Nave and other SOD theorists, such as Dr. Ofer Gracier, coached and led design praxis, they described the methodology as praxis of discovery or the perpetual cognitive operation of spiraling from description through problematization to synthesis. Nave offered a description of the designer journey towards what he called metacognitive awareness, or what we will use the term reflective practice, thinking about your thinking as you are in action. This is where designers move between an emerging ontological awareness and the designer's reflection upon their institutional's epistemological choices, how the organization knows it knows things about warfare. This design emphasized transformative qualities upon not just the ways of which the organization might craft new strategic options, but also deeply within the core institutional frame to challenge one's institutional outlook upon war itself. Nave observed that the first step of self-transformation of one's worldview represented the most demanding part of SOD. In Nave's model for design education, some instructors estimated that 10 to 20% of a typical SOD class would fail to achieve course objectives, largely due to those students being unable to let go of a, quote, career planner mindset, or due to academic limitations preventing them from processing SOD at the graduate level of instruction. Learning SOD was always considered difficult. SOD expected a student self-transformation to remain the most difficult educational challenge for the instructors to facilitate and for design students to experience. In Nave's unpublished reflections on teaching SOD, as well as select interviews, he frequently discussed the process of design students experiencing a growing frustration, usually indicating to Nave that they were close to cognitive culmination, leading to an increase in metacognitive awareness. Design teams undergoing SOD education would be observed to have mental exhaustion. Often only after iteratively failing in the SOD process would they achieve some moment of illumination after experiencing a state of deep frustration. In 2004 to 2006, some would not bother with learning SOD within the Israeli Defense Force, and many Israeli officers at the time of Nave's grand experiment either found precious little time to dedicate to learning such a challenging concept, with many others believing it to be, quote, utter nonsense. SOD's simultaneous demands of abandoning much of one's previous military experience and expertise, coupled with the highly sophisticated and dense literature comprising the new design foundations, appeared to severely limit the quantity of student interest, as well as those able to make the intellectual pilgrimage. For SOD educators, applying the concepts in the classroom only after students consciously complete a cognitive breakout could they coherently engage in the exploitation which concerned revisiting conceptual products constructed in the course of the previous days. This element of how deep frustration and self-transformation likely created some significant barriers for how Nave and his team of design educators intended to transform the larger Israeli Defense Force, as well as subsequent experimentation across Western strategic partners and allies. The reflective learning process for SOD utilizes a, quote, thesis, antithesis, synthesis dialectic, where designers iteratively play devil's advocate to challenge the design biases and experiment in theorizing and then inquiring into the system while learning. SOD's design epistemology, shown on the right side of this slide, starts with a configuration of systemic inquiry so that the SOD methodology has a broad, holistic position to begin constructing frames of understanding about emerging ecologies and complexity. The SOD methodology, depicted in the original and most well-known format on the left, applies geometric structures to depict the various iterative and nonlinear design activities. Although in Nave's writings and his after-action reports, there appears to be some sequences linked. SOD seeks the selection of a frame to depict a system of theoretical artifacts that is accomplished only by the SOD designer using a systemic inquiry. Now note, it's systemic, not systematic, as we covered earlier. Awareness of the designer's own paradigm is necessary in SOD, denoting at the epistemological level a need to frame multiple paradigms in order to establish a pattern of self-created learning, as well as a strong awareness of where your frame ends and the frames of rivals begin. This is where regulating design observation and considering observed systems using systemic inquiry will help develop novel opportunities in emergent strategic context, according to SOD. Lastly, the epistemological structure that continues SOD in an iterative, nonlinear, and emergent design practice is the maintenance of a regime of systematic adaptive learning. SOD requires this to be perpetual, iterative, but also dynamic, and in a self-referential way, able to conceptualize a multitude of design frames, effects, and functions that can be operationalized in military activities to alter a system behavior to the future advantage of the designer's organization. While commercial design seeks new products and user experiences to improve reality, Nave's military design operates in security contexts, and it seeks to destroy the existing warfare logic, everything above and beyond the tactical and the technical. And SOD was his effort in design transformation through cognitive destruction and creativity beyond the legacy ideas of war. In the following clips, Nave himself explains a little bit on how SOD as a military design is destructive concerning war logics.
In order, you see people, everybody talks about change and transformation, the chief. And as the J3 said, everybody talks about transformation, but actually nobody is transforming anything. Why? Because in order to change, you have to destroy. Not physically, to burn, to kill, you have to very much reject, ignore, move to the side, something that you possess, that you hold dear, and all of a sudden it's irrelevant.
So the first step to innovation,
Yeah.
which is what everyone
Oh
wants,
yeah,
is actually destruction.
Destruction.
But the cultural resistance in Western industrialized military is just based upon the traditions, the structures, the professional education, the ranks, everything is geared towards not doing that
Yeah,
with the boss.
I know, because
right?
we are idealists. That's the problem. This is why the designer must operate within the tension of idealism and heresy. And idealism means everything that we know is sacred. No.
So the senior leaders that are across militaries that are trying to do this, that really do want that innovation, one of the best things they can do is foster those safe environments
Yeah.
for their
Yeah.
subordinates that want to do this design, to have those discussions of annihilation.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have just scratched the surface on SOD. For design executive sessions and master classes such as this, you have now received an overview of SOD. If you decide to send students to the Joint Special Operations University, they will be exposed to additional SOD theory, doctrine, as well as case studies, exploring how SOD has been applied both successfully and also unsuccessfully in Israel, as well as the United States Department of Defense, USSOCOM, as well as other militaries over the last 25 years. In the Soft Design Advanced course at JSOU, students can study SOD at a much deeper level, to include extensive access to difficult-to-find documents, access to Shimon Nave's research, unpublished documents, as well as interviews. Additionally, JSOU has uploaded 8 Nave interviews under the Think JSOU Legends of Design series on YouTube. Lastly, civilian websites, such as the Archipelago of Design, feature extensive amounts of SOD material that is published, such as the work of Dr. Ofer Graescher. Next, we're going to move to the U.S. Army Design Methodology, or ADM. Nave's original first generation of SOD had a particular geometric structure, a philosophy, as well as a language. However, what the United States Army ushered into doctrine by 2010 looked most unlike the parent. The American Army's aptly nicknamed three-ball chart of different frames for doing the design process became more mechanical and largely nestled to the institutionally favored language and concepts such as elements of operational art, centers of gravity, as well as the notion of problem being isolated even within a complex adaptive system. While some saw the production of an Army design methodology as a trepidation and marker for everything potentially wrong with the military assimilation of design, others saw it as a triumph and an indication of institutional willingness to transform. On this slide, the ADM methodological form follows an ends, ways, means epistemological underpinning of the traditional military planning methodology. This includes reductionism and analytic optimization. Whether using the military decision-making process, the joint planning process, or other service-specific or NATO variant, ADM in doctrine and practice directs the designer to incorporate operational planning concepts such as elements of operational art, the centers of gravity as mentioned earlier, and other related doctrinal concepts that rely upon mechanistic, engineering, or Newtonian physics-based metaphors. Additionally, all of these planning constructs tend to operate at the tactical and are reapplied at the strategic level using extremely close language, as well as a shared epistemology concerning warfare and the organizational form of military actions. Although the top graphic is what the United States Army advocates in doctrine and in practice for the ADM method, this three-ball chart tends to create nearly as much procedural confusion for designers as well as the SOD geometric graphic shown in the previous section. Unlike human-centered design methodologies such as the Stanford design sequence of hexagonal iterative design activities, ADM moves from creating an environmental frame using existing established planning constructs towards a problem frame. Designers subsequently move to developing an operational approach. This methodology repeats itself in a self-referential manner where the ADM doctrine prescribes any reframe for when designers need to repeat the same design methodology, reapplying potentially different elements of operational art and attempting to revalidate existing planning methodologies and established uniform military doctrine through the design practice and experimentation of ADM. This demonstrates the epistemology of ADM as demonstrated below at the bottom part of this slide. ADM, from an epistemological standpoint, or thinking about the design's thinking, starts with addressing what the legacy system is and how the designers realize that in this environmental frame there is what used to be with what has seemed to have changed and created a problem requiring this military attention. Thus, the environmental frame for ADM advocates a frame of the legacy system coupled with explaining apparent tensions or paradox that is problematic for that Army organization. It likely includes unexpected or never before contemplated complexity that will need to be further reduced into a problem frame for further design. The problem frame for ADM is once again epistemologically the creation of potential new ways to a new end that need to be experimented with in prototypes, typically by Army designers generating iterations conceptually or testing within simulated wargame scenarios in order to determine which new ways work and correspond with the design of the new ends in a problem-solution frame termed the operational approach. ADM then applies a convergent epistemological structure where designers orient their design approach towards a design solution mindset that attempts to result in military planning at the strategic, operational, or tactical level of war for that organization. Here, ADM, at that epistemological level once more, shares with other design methodologies such as SOD or human-centered design an iterative epistemology for design experimentation and non-linear divergent thinking, as well as critical thinking towards the organizational form and function. However, ADM as a design methodology does not feature the same epistemological structure for designers to consider their paradigm or organizational frame towards reality, as SOD and to a lesser degree human-centered design does. Thus, ADM potentially generates single paradigm design processes where the designer lacks reflective practice. This is further compounded by the ADM doctrinal prescription for designers to follow the form, to do ADM over and over in reframes exactly as the doctrine states, to apply established planning concepts and uniform, often rigid planning language, and if reframing, repeat the process without reflection upon the form. Instead, ADM focuses designers upon the design content that the methodology establishes, and the entire ADM methodology becomes a design solution-centric mindset. This is different from what SOD and many applications of human-centered design generate with a design learning mindset of exploration, experimentation, increased cognitive risk, and developmental growth. ADM can achieve this, provided that it reinforces existing Army doctrine and established practices and does not violate core reductionist logics for analytic-based optimization and technical rationalization in strategic through tactical actions within the United States Army established decision-making methodologies and doctrine. We have just completed a brief overview of the U.S. Army design methodology. Students attending JSOU's Design Fundamentals online course or the Design Basic course in residence or also online will get further exposure to ADM through the theory, practice, doctrine, as well as case studies across SOCOM, the Department of Defense, and beyond. In our Advanced Design course for graduates of the 3440 basic course, students can opt to go even deeper into studying ADM theory, methodology, and intricate case studies available only through JSOU exclusive content. We're going to cover Australian proto-design as we term it next. Proto-design means that it has some design features, but it's still not really a formal military design methodology, in that in Australia, this type of design is not really taught in the professional military education, at least not as a design methodology, nor is it formally in their doctrine, nor is it used across their force. Adaptive campaigning is essentially the combination of complexity theory, iterative activities instead of linear sequences added to the traditional military operational planning process. The Australian adaptive campaigning methodology uses several graphics to depict their concept, with the one depicted on the left-hand side of this slide as the most recognized in their doctrine. The cycle of adaptive action draws heavily from U.S. Air Force Colonel John Boyd's OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, that cycles through learning and acting. Boyd's epistemology structured towards speed of learning and acting, in that the use of his OODA loop should permit them to outpace their adversary in speed and activity. The Australian variation here for the design shifts the epistemology to that of learning to learn, or improving metacognition towards innovation and organizational transformation instead of an emphasis on speed. Australian adaptive campaigning states in its doctrine that mission command as a concept is central to the entire methodology for their designing approach, while mission command in numerous military forces refer to earlier German decision-making methodologies expressing decentralized emphasis on initiative, and for higher leadership further from the decisive war activities to cede judgment and defer earlier strategies and plans to those in contact and best able to make immediate and critical combat decisions. Mission command in practice has remained an epistemological structure to generally retain and protect the centralized hierarchical form of organization for traditional militaries in the industrialized West. Mission command provides clear control of the thinking process of the organization concerning complex dynamic conflicts, and here it's placed graphically as the hub or the center of the Australian adaptive campaigning concept. The adaptive action cycle uses system framing and implies designers have self-reflection or think about their thinking, which epistemologically does open up potential multi-paradigmic concepts, although like the American Army design methodology in practice, it may also reinforce a single paradigm incommensurability. That is, the single preferred paradigm of the military organization could be projected upon all the stakeholders despite it being set in a complex emergent system, and any observed tensions or interplay between the different paradigms are marginalized, ignored, or rationalized as anomalies. The term "the enemy has a vote," uttered by many operations officers during the planning and strategy sessions, illustrates this epistemological assumption to reinforce a single paradigm belief structure. Adaptive action directs systemic adaptation, where the designers frame their system using system logic, which can be described as a probe, sense, respond construct. This is often applied to permit experimentation, rapid failure, and the organizational tolerance of learning to learn to promote this learning organization. Speed does play a role here, however, learning becomes the central focus. Further, the Australian adaptive campaigning construct places emphasis in doctrine for institutional values and matters that are important to the institution to convey any divergent concepts or aspects of disruptive or emergent ideas towards military activities. Epistemologically, this might become a self-referential way to eliminate any concepts that are in tension or critically challenge core Australian military institutional beliefs, implying a socialized path to protect a single paradigm within that military organization. This may potentially place the Australian adaptive action cycle closer to the U.S. Army design methodology and may prevent designers from considering multiple paradigms, or deeply disruptive concepts that provide innovative or game-changing designs requiring the destruction or retirement of core ritualized behaviors, organizational forms, or highly institutionalized practices. AAC frames their cycle as a perpetual learning cycle, where critical and creative, as in divergent thinking, is repeated in a nonlinear and iterative loop, such as the Boyd's-OODA loop, to disrupt static behaviors and challenge traditional perspectives through divergent thinking. Thus, the AAC in doctrine, graphical depiction, and in underlying epistemological structures has portions that encourage reflective practice and innovation through design activities. However, in other core portions of this doctrine, it endorses a strong, centralized, military hierarchical form and function, while also creating the conditions for a single military paradigm dominance and highly convergent activities that are more established in traditional or legacy military decision-making models and strategies. There's a whole source of different material academically that is now available where the discussion of what Australia should or could do concerning military design is now pushing the military forward in Australia in 2021. If you consider sending personnel to JSOU for design education, they will be exposed to Australian design theory, doctrine, and initiatives in the Design Fundamentals online distance or our basic or advanced design courses. Next, we're going to briefly introduce yet another proto-design being provided to Canadian Armed Forces and international students at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. Canada has been experimenting with design in their PMA programs since 2013, with extensive expansion occurring since 2015. The right side of the slide here shows a mixed methods and multiple design methodologies approach that the Canadian Forces College provides to their students during the formal design education of their field grade academic year and for senior officers during their War College academic year. The CFC draws from human-centered design variants as well as multiple mainstream military design methodologies including SOD, ADM, and others. The Canadians' epistemology then, if we limit it to just Toronto, where the Canadian Forces College is driving the vast majority of design experimentation, is structured in what they term agnostic design. The Canadian Forces College is unique in their design educational approach by introducing multiple design methodologies for students to consider, and they don't really emphasize one over the other. However, each student seminar usually gets exposure to a single design methodology, primarily based on the outside design facilitator brought into the exercise. Faculty will try to rotate the students and the methodologies around as much as possible. Thus, while some students ideally rotate through and discuss with their colleagues about their unique design experiences within the CFC program, it is also possible that some students gain an appreciation of just the single design methodology promoted by their small group facilitator. The Canadian Forces College seminar interaction structure, as another key epistemological form in their mixed design methodology, encourages critical self-reflection as well as exposure to other groups experimenting with dissimilar or even contradictory design methods while facing the same strategic security challenge. Here, the CFC promotes design interplay at the methodological as well as epistemological levels, demonstrating what paradigm theorists describe as paradigm overlap, tensions, and interplay that promote deep organizational consideration and reflection, as well as fostering innovation. Similar to Israeli SOD and Australian design methodologies, the Canadian Forces College promotes a perpetual learning epistemology in how they educate, experiment, and practice design. There is no Canadian design doctrine. By introducing different design methodologies under the CFC program, Canadian and international students have an opportunity to challenge design ontologies, epistemologies, as well as different methods and doctrinal applications in design. This potentially opens up a unique opportunity for emergent design practice and disruptive design theory. The cross-pollination of different designs could spawn entirely novel practice. Or, conversely, it may create the opposite conditions and generate multiple tribes of design advocates holding incommensurate views on military design and practice. In 2021, the Canadian Forces College continues to move forward promoting this agnostic design approach for their military design education. So far in this masterclass, we've covered a wide range of design methodologies. There are many other types of design, including Agile, Scrum, and the United States Marine Corps design methodology, just to name a few. But this masterclass is just covering a select few to provide you with an overview and also set up how JSOU provides design education in what we term a meta-methodological approach, as depicted here. The methodology is shown on the left, and the epistemology of this multi-domain, multidisciplinary approach is shown on the right. The epistemology of how JSOU provides design education works off of assumptions just like all the previously discussed design methods feature. In this case, these are tailored to special operations forces as design practitioners in acknowledgement that soft designers will have unique security or other organizational contexts that require a meta-theoretical appreciation of multiple design methods. Think of it as mixed martial arts. A soft design team may work within an organization that could be task organized under coalition, joint, multiple services, or other agencies where the higher design sponsor or the strategic design recipient wants design done one particular way. And then, as that changes, the soft design team may need to move to another sponsor or within another context. And thus, advocating a single design methodology is going to be insufficient within soft context and for soft personnel, considering the joint, coalition, and interagency context that soft finds themselves in regularly. Further, this soft design methodology also remains anti-self-referential and open. What we mean by that is, unlike some of the previous design methods where if one were to reframe with Army design methodology, one has to follow the Army design methodology as well as the supporting doctrine that ADM directs designers use. In this case, JSOU design suggests if you are going to change the design reframe, one might also change the design itself. In order to do this, JSOU provides design education that is meta-design, or, as you've seen in the previous sections, covering all different types and different ways of doing design. This opens the aperture for more divergent, creative, and innovative combinations that designers otherwise in a single disciplinary focus would not have access to. Thus, there is no single way of doing design. There's no SOF or SOCOM design way at JSOU. Rather, there's a multitude and an enriching, expanding, and emergent path that designers can self-create along the way. Even JSOU design educators will not be able to imagine some of the combinations that could emerge if soft designers that use this approach are truly applying creative, emergent, and new combinations. Design can be done in many other ways, provided that the designers think about their thinking, as in reflective practice, and always consider alternative perspectives within complex reality, particularly concerning deeply held institutional beliefs, military rituals, the metaphors behind military language, and other socialized and socially constructed elements that add that second-order complexity on top of an already complex real world. First, the JSOU design methodology emphasizes self-awareness of one's own paradigm or worldview, recognizing our own frame and how we in our organizations tend to look at warfare, conflicts, security, and the world. Next, the designer's awareness of other paradigms, of other stakeholder perspectives in this second-order complexity is necessary for them to move to framing the organization, considering systemic rivals and emergent futures. The JSOU design methodology moves the design team to develop systemic understanding of reality with an appreciation that complex dynamic systems are emergent. Here, an emphasis on systemic thinking and an awareness of frequent institutional bias towards reductionist analytic thinking can fragment the design frame of a complex reality. This emergent quality also establishes the importance of multiple futures for designers to consider, whether using scenario planning methodology, postmodern concepts such as assemblages and rhizomes, or another construct. Some way of breaking away from the traditional ends, ways, means construct is required, if only to provide designers an additional perspective to gain deeper appreciation of complex, dynamic, and emergent systems. The JSOU design methodology then incorporates nonlinear emergent design both in form and in function. Here, design reflective practitioners will render novel designs while also considering the context of their design method as well as the form of the design methodology itself. This generates iterative, tailored design outputs or alterations, such as a radical redesign of the design output or the design method itself. These can be tailored to any SOF context, and they also remain unique as well as temporary. Lastly, the JSOU design meta-methodology here takes an epistemological structure to maintain a regime of systemic and innovative learning. In a perpetual iterative process for cognitive growth, reflection, and experimentation, SOF designers foster divergent thinking as well as appreciate the disruptive qualities of novel ideas and actions taken within a complex system. This regime is iterative, highly experimental, and necessitates cognitive as well as tangible prototypes. These prototypes are to be employed in simulations as well as the competitive domains for military action in order to test whether these designs provide the SOF organization with that which it needs, but is only now coming into existence through the reflective practice of SOF designers. This JSOU design school of thought is now taught at the NATO School in Oberammergau, Germany, as well as various international war colleges such as Sweden, Canada, and others. This meta-methodology has also greatly influenced military design at professional military education institutions in the Polish Armed Forces, U.S. Space Command, United States Air Force Squadron Officers School, and others. And of course, JSOU has inculcated this design education across the SOCOM enterprise with international partners, agencies, and others. For more information on the range of JSOU courses available concerning design education, you can refer to the JSOU main registration page located here. Next, we're going to move to the very last design exercise for this master class. For this last exercise in this masterclass, we're going to send you over to YouTube to the link above. And there's a 6-minute clip there by Abbott and Costello. It's the famous Who's on First baseball routine. Now, a lot of you probably have heard this or you're familiar with it. What we want you to do is watch the clip for 6 minutes and then take a pen and paper or whatever you have available. And we want you to draw out how you explain the entire scene. Doesn't matter if you're a good artist or not, we want to see the patterns, and we're going to get to that after this. So what we mean by explain over describe, we're going to hit in the next video before you start the exercise. But what we want you to do is watch the video, and then you're going to have to draw your explanation. And so when we say explanation, what we mean by that is we don't need a description. So if I was to ask you what your favorite meal is, and if you were to say, well, it was my mother's spaghetti meatballs, and she got it from my grandmother's recipe, but our grandmother's, she died, and so it wasn't written down, and so only my mother knows how to make this, and I go to her house a couple of months out of the year, and that's all I want, and that is my favorite meal. Now that's explanation, right? Now if we asked you to describe your favorite meal, you would say, well, my mother takes 1 pound of pasta and then she heats the water up to 365 degrees and then she boils the pasta. She takes the meat and it's a combination of 1/3 lamb, 1/3 chicken. You get the point. So description is more of the recipe and explanation is why that is your favorite meal. So going back to this design challenge, take a look at the video, watch it, and then explain, not describe what's going on in a drawing. I'm going to unpackage very quickly and give you this example and say, well, this is how we do what we do and why you as designers, when you're doing this, this is how you can shape a design experience so that you can shift them from a solutions-based, convergent mindset, which is what our militaries really are conditioned for with everything that we do, with all of our training and our doctrine and our language and the ontology and the epistemology just operating behind the scenes. And we are, as designers, facilitating, challenging it, disrupting it, bringing attention to it so that you can break it and try something different. I handed out a bunch of, there's handouts out there. I only had 30, so some of you got them, some of you didn't. They went with the briefing that you're probably not going to see. And in there are a whole bunch of articles that I've written over the years, over the past 10 years, that are lined up with all these things. Because what I've been doing as a designer is experimentation, theory work, and then practical application with students as well as in real-world environments when I was deployed in Afghanistan, as well as all the different organizations I've worked with, to including working with the Joint Special Operations University, where I currently am. And I want to open source all of this, and that's what I've been doing the entire time. As soon as these articles get out, they're for everybody, because nobody owns design, and no one should. Design is something that you need to learn, you need to participate in, you need to grow. And the next person who's going to take this to the next level, we don't know where they are. They could be in this room. They could be reading something or viewing it. And that's why it's important to share this. And I think open source is the way to go. So on that, a real quick thought here. When we're doing design facilitation, whether it's for real-world applications or if you're in the classroom, I'd like you to think of this as being a Sherpa, being a design Sherpa. And the way I like to use this example is that we're helping people, organizations, up a mountain, a challenge, if you will. And what's interesting is that it's not about us. We are not superheroes. Now, there are people that do design this way, and I don't think it's very useful. And the superhero designers, you may have seen them, is they show up when you turn on the bat light or whatever, you call for help and say, my organization needs design, come here. And they show up in the muscle suit with the cape, and it's looking really great, and they do design for you. And when they're done, they leave and they go, you can call me whenever you need me again. And the organization goes, thanks, Superman, and then they're gone. And they're like, hey, we need design again. Fire up that bat light, we need some help. And so the organization becomes dependent upon these people to come and help them, but they don't grow. And they almost create models where they just say, yeah, let's just hire in those consultants or those contractors, or bring them in here and do it. What we need to do is say, we're design Sherpas. We're bringing you up the hill, and as we bring you up the mountain, you are learning to climb your own mountains. And as you do it more and more with us, you are growing your own capabilities so that you won't need us, or you'll become Sherpas yourself within your organizations. And as you discover these new mountains, you're climbing different mountains that we've not even imagined, which is important. And so Sherpas carry the load. When you're doing design facilitation, you're carrying a lot of extra things because you're helping that organization unpackage some things that are holding them back. And so design facilitators, design Sherpas, we're going to bring in a lot of extra thing, and we unpack what we think we need, but it happens in the moment. So it's hard to script it. It's really hard. You have to kind of see what's going on and go, I think that simulacra as a concept would really work here. This group, we've got to look at scenario planning. This group right now needs help with social paradigm awareness. That group needs to break away from the planning tools. And so just with what we did here with the JAWS exercise, and I'll show you why we did it, we're disarming you of some of your tools so you can realize and pick up new ones. And so design Sherpas are not like real Sherpas. We don't memorize the routes and just take people up and down the same mountain over and over. Design challenges are always new. They're new even to us. But there are patterns. So you can establish base camps even on entirely new design challenges because there are certain patterns. And there's certain things, just like with the JAWS exercise that I'll show you, that groups continue to do over and over and over, very reliably. Design Sherpas can also kill the party. And this is one of those gritty truths, is that if we are arrogant, if we are biased, we're all biased, but if we use our own biases to the disadvantage of the organization, we can get them killed, metaphorically or literally, as well as get ourselves killed in the process. And so when you are doing design, it's not, let's just do whatever we want. There are consequences to all of our actions. Lastly, when you're up at the top of the mountain, you're not Superman. You're there to hold the camera. That is that organization's achievement. You are behind the camera, behind the scenes, helping them out, and then as soon as they're off, you're going back down the hill to help the next group up the mountain and help them with their challenges. That's an important thing to remember. So, many mountains to climb. Here's the so what. Things are changing. We've hit this really hard today. Let me push through these. Okay, so Trojan horsing. This is kind of the central theme to what I talk about and what I wanted to present. Trojan horsing is essentially providing these concepts in a way that the organization will take, because if you told them really what you were doing, they just flat out walk out of the room. And a lot of these concepts that we do, they're not ready for, so you've got to smuggle it in. Now, you're not doing it to deceive them. You're doing it to help them unlock and drop these tools. And so this is really a lot about thinking about thinking. We've talked about this throughout the whole day. I won't belabor it. I want to get to this one. So scientists, sheriff badges, shark teeth, and dollar signs. In all the iterations that I've done this in all the different forms, it used to be in other videos, but we switched to the JAWS one after a while, and it works really well. We get the same thing every time through thousands and thousands of people, right? The first drawings look like this every time. Even though you ask people to explain, we drop our tools, we're said, hey, we can't write words, and we end up drawing the very same symbols. Almost always, dollar signs, sheriff badges, sharks, beakers. And that's not that it's wrong, but just be mindful and facilitate why your organization does this. They do this because you take away their favorite tools, problem statements, SWOT analysis, PMISI PT, lines of effort, centers of gravity. They can do all that on the boards. And if you remember the Polish briefing where it was all words, words, words on day one, Amelie's group, that's what they'll run to, their favorite tools. So you take them away. And you still get convergence. Why? Because these are still their favorite tools. They're just masked as drawings. So you take their words away, and they still give you words. And it's just our natural reaction. We all do it. It's not that we're dumb. It's just this is what we're hardwired to do as a group. And it's forced upon us through our entire military experience, and we don't even realize it until it punches us in the face. And then when you take that away, this is what happens every single time. Every group goes from convergence, drawing the same exact things, within 20 minutes, are drawing completely different things in wildly divergent directions, having incredible design discussions about what does this even mean? What does shark mean? What does fear mean? They have incredible discussions. But you can't get to those unless you, as the design Sherpa, facilitate them dropping those tools, the favorite tools that they have, so that they're willing to pick up new ones. And so we Trojan horse in these techniques, and then you bring it back. You must have this iterative process of doing and sharing and discussing and thinking about why you do what you do. Because it's not what's on the board. It's what's above the board that really matters to you. What is the ontology and epistemology is here, and it governs the methodological outputs on the boards themselves. And that will happen with every aspect of design. All right, we don't have time to do this, but I can talk to you about it later. This is organizations that do covert and clandestine activities, and they're generally, there's a difference between them. Clandestine activities is essentially something goes bump in the night, and it's not loud enough for you to get out of bed, so you don't pay attention. And so it happens, but nobody cares. And that's really what clandestine activities are. It's about intelligence gathering and surveillance and all these things so that Tom Cruise, the cool guy, can get the plan so that he can go and do the covert stuff. And covert means that there is a bump in the night. It's extremely loud. Everybody gets up to investigate, and you find what happened. But you don't know who did it. You don't know who the sponsor was. It's a mystery, right? And so that's an important distinction. Military organizations that do this, though, they get trapped in their own boxes, in their frames, and they grab their favorite tools and they don't want to let go. So one of these groups would say, well, we're like wolves in sheep's clothing. And that became their worldview. So if you structure something like this, well, okay, I see what you're saying, wolf in sheep's clothing. Let me do the opposites of that, which we get to sheep in sheep's clothing, which is a great Winston Churchill description of a prime minister. And we have sheep in wolf's clothing. Well, that doesn't make any sense. They like this one. Oh, I like wolf and wolf. That's like a super wolf. And so we start talking about this, and we talk about Tom Cruise. So Tom Cruise rips his mask off. You know, he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, and he pulls the mask off and reveals himself. And there's Tom Cruise jumping out of an airplane. He's wolfing it up, super wolf. And that's really where the organizations tend to stop, whether they're clandestine or covert. How do you break them out of that? Well, in the movies, right, there's always Tom Cruise's buddy, Simon Pegg, comedic guy. You know, he's the sheep, but he's helping the wolf. And this is where we talk about, well, how can we have sheep in sheep's clothing? And then this last one, I'm sorry for pop culture, I had to go to Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Those of you who haven't seen it, spoiler alert, it's from 1991. And he ends up ripping the face off of a prisoner guard to disguise himself so that he can have a sheep in wolf's clothing and make people think that the guard was the prisoner, and so he could escape. Now, what does all this matter? Well, when you're facilitating with the organization, you're trying to get them out of their mindset, this is where they're stuck after you frame it. But you can't tell them this right outright or they'll fight you. But you have to facilitate getting them to think about these other areas, unwitting, unwilling deception, as well as hybrids between these. And as you engage in these discussions through activities and exercises, you can move them out of their comfort space very carefully as a facilitator to have them explore different options. And in events like these, Tom Cruise and his gang are having phenomenal conversations over here that they never could get to because previously their organization, their culture, their belief system, their values, their identity, and because they're all secret, secret, hush, hush, they have the club there and they go, well, we know what we're doing, and that's the way it is. And we don't think about this other stuff. So this is just another example of being a design facilitator. Last topic, serious play. Design facilitation has to include play. It has to. And the activity that you just had of getting up on the boards, of being a team, of sharing, of challenging each other, we find that the more that you can do this, and we'll do a little bit tomorrow, if it's not playful, it's not going to work. People don't get comfortable with thinking about radical ideas, especially when there's that social conditioning of preventing us from, we want to be serious. And when you think about those of you, I'm a recovering planner, those of you that have been in a jock or in a planning cell, and it's 11:30 at night, and you're working on slide 72, right? And the guy next to you's got a big thing of tobacco, and he's just falling asleep, and then you've got 3 cups of coffee, and it's suck it up, keep going, do it, right? Being aware of that culture, and being aware that that is not going to work for when you need people to be creative, innovative, disruptive. You have to have the element of play. And if you are in an environment where you have to do these 6, 7, 8-hour shifts, and you're supposed to do design, you need to make breaks. You need to get them out of the room. You got to have them playing football. Get them outside into the gym. Have them go for a run. Have them do something. Todd's got a great story in Afghanistan of doing precisely that, of getting them to go out and play and do stuff. And they didn't really understand why until they started seeing that, look, that's when your brain relaxes. That's where you start coming up with new ideas. And then when you come back in on the boards, you're willing to do things. Giving them things to play with, Legos, Play-Doh, Slinkies. All these things will actually stimulate their minds in ways that planners generally aren't comfortable with. And I'm not knocking planners. I'm just saying that we as design Sherpas have to facilitate this in everything you do, including the room composition and the materials and putting music on. All of this will create that right environment. So we're out of time, so I'll leave you on this thought. All ideas die. Some live long enough to meet their replacement. So when you are a disruptive innovator, when you are a design Sherpa, you are bringing organizations up summits that they are not prepared for because it's something they've not yet seen, but it's exactly what they need to gain that advantage. But in order for them to get it, in order for them to climb up that mountain, they've got to let go of their favorite tools. The tools that won't get them up the mountain because it's not the right tool. But they're clutching those tools desperately because that's what worked yesterday. How can you get them to grow and try something new? And that's your challenge. So I know we're out of time, and I appreciate your patience. And tomorrow we're going to do one more exercise, and I look forward to talking with each of you during dinner or during the break. So thank you very much. If you are watching this last portion, that means that you've been doing this masterclass autonomously, and we recommend that you still bring a bunch of people together if you can, even virtually, to do some drawings and then talk about them. So when you bring together your drawing and you look at others, we want you to think about the patterns that may be forming. Hundreds of students have done this at JSOU, and we're going to show you a couple of examples so that you can compare your drawing and those of your group and see if you can start thinking above the board, above the drawing, and really become a reflective practitioner in design. This is a typical image of what we tend to see a lot of design students do. These images reflect a analytic, almost descriptive mode of trying to take the scene and map it out to make sense. This may reflect part of military culture as well as what our profession desires us to do in terms of thought and action. Some of these drawings become very elaborate, with students attempting to really describe instead of explain, using mathematics, physics, engineering, and other metaphors. Some students will even go as far as to count out and map all the words in the entire routine, where this is extraordinarily descriptive, but it doesn't really provide any insight for humor, jokes, comedy, irony or paradox. Often students will default back to what their primary job is within a security organization, using software, mapping, or other techniques from their own jobs to attempt to demonstrate what the joke means to them. But are they explaining it, or are they describing it using some of their favorite tools? The strongest pattern we see with most students attempting this challenge is for them to literally draw the baseball diamond and then attempt to map out, using the words within the joke, some sort of sequence or structure. Over and over again, we see lots and lots of baseball diamonds with the same words, who, what, where, and when, as well as all the other jokes, mapped out and structured. This demonstrates, when seeking patterns in design, a propensity of the organization to force certain tools over and over back into how we make sense of a challenge. If your organization is seeking design innovation, these types of patterns are what leaders can look for in order to move their organization away from their favorite tools and move them into drawing and framing this in a different way. The purpose of this exercise is not to move towards convergent thinking or to drive towards an ideal or desired single end state. Instead, this is about thinking about your organization and thinking about patterns, seeking the different, the unusual, those that are not using the same tools that everyone else is using. And many of these ideas will promote themselves just through exercises like this. The challenge for design facilitators, as well as design leaders that want their organizations to do more of this type of thinking, is how to shift your organization away from just drawing baseball diamonds over and over and moving into really different ways of trying to frame something that's complex and challenging. When you start seeing some of this stuff manifest, particularly in these types of exercises, it'll really start to pop out. This is one of the images that I really enjoyed seeing from a beginning design student on week 2 of our distance course. It's different, it's clear, but it's profound. A lot of the different symbols that we normally see have been adjusted or shifted. There's a lot of thought-provoking narrative captured into this drawing. Now sometimes you'll have artists and they'll make some really fascinating, really well-detailed pictures, but sometimes the fancy drawings don't really constitute anything other than the same types of description. And what we see over and over is those same patterns. Are the designers describing or explaining? Facilitators and senior leaders will have to be able to make these distinctions by looking at a large series of drawings, which is once again why iterations and multiple design activities is best at larger and larger groups, as you can accommodate design activities within your organization. Let's take a look at the next 2 drawings here. This first one is really interesting. Now the student was clever and used someone else's artwork, but what they layered on top and blended into this is a rich, interesting, and thought-provoking image. It generated a lot of discussion in the course. This is what you're looking for when it comes to divergence. Let's compare that to this drawing. Now this is actually pretty standard. It's what most of our students do in this exercise, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's highly analytical, it's structured, it's trying to map out. But if you were to look at the drawing previously in this one, which one do you think is more explanatory and which one's more descriptive? Once again, the whole point of doing design is to explain so that we can generate new meaning and new ideas. Description is best for planning, and planning is not design, nor is design planning. So whether you're operating in a group with facilitation for this exercise or you're doing this autonomously, gathering up some other drawings and then looking at their drawings, your drawings, and the drawings that we've presented here can help you think about your thinking, recognizing patterns, and more importantly, asking the why and the how of what's going on above the drawings, what's going on inside of your organization's way of how they make sense of things and how they're trying to articulate new ideas. The whole point is that we want to start dropping our favorite tools and knowing why we keep trying to reach for them instead of experimenting with new and unfamiliar tools. And as we see in these drawings, some students favor a certain set of tools that you all will recognize, while other students will not. The whole key is, as a facilitator or a leader, Can you encourage or nudge your organization to draw a baseball diamond without drawing the baseball diamond? Congratulations! You've reached the end of this JSOU Military Design 101 Master's Course. Feel free to utilize other JSOU courses, other materials at Think JSOU, as well as any of the references that we've provided in this online, publicly available JSOU Design course.